Good evening, all, and thank you very much for joining us. As you come in and as you are able, if you would consider renaming yourself, we do this format on purpose so we can see who we are in community with. And so to rename yourself, you would go over the top three dots in the top right corner of your screen. It will say rename, and you can add your class years if you would like to do that. If you are not quite sure how to do that, you can go into the chat, which you'll find along the bottom, and you could put your class year, and Caitlin Duncan or I can help do that for you. The best way to enjoy our program this evening is also to go into the top right corner and put speaker view, and Caitlin and I will be kind of driving this show, so you have the best view that way. Thank you very much for staying muted, and also that there is closed captioning available, and you're going to find that at the bottom of your screen. So if you have any questions, my name is Jenny Savino. I work in the alumni office, and my wonderful colleague Caitlin Duncan is here, and either of us can help you with anything. So just come into the chat and just let us know what your question is. And at this time, I would like to introduce a wonderful volunteer that we have a privilege to work with, Lynn Langlois Hunter, class of 1990. Lynn?
Hi, everybody, and welcome. I'm really excited for everybody to be joining us here tonight for the June Leaf Shooting from the Heart in partnership with the Addison Gallery. We are so fortunate to have Ali Kemmerer and Gordon Wilkins here from the Addison to take us through this event virtually. And I would strongly encourage anybody who is able to come and actually see it in person. But in lieu of that, please enjoy this evening. And Abbott at Andover is really happy that this is an opportunity for us to share this wonderful resource on campus with everybody. Take it away.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm going to just cue our PowerPoint up. Here we go. And then we will start from the beginning. You'd think after 5 years, I wouldn't have anxiety that people can't see my screen, but hopefully everyone can see my screen.
Looks good.
Okay, I'm going to hand it off to Allison Kemmerer to introduce our program.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Ali Kemmerer. I am the Crosby, Kemper, and Mary Strip Director of the Addison Gallery. I've been director for almost 5 years now, but I've been at the Addison for over 30. So I actually started as an intern and worked my way up through the curatorial ranks. And now I'm director. So it is my pleasure to welcome you. And we're here tonight to give you a glimpse of the newly opened June Leaf Shooting from the Heart exhibition. And this is the most comprehensive showing of the artist's work in more than 3 decades. The exhibition considers the breadth of Leaf's career with more than 150 sculptures, paintings, and works on paper that are placed in conversation across media to reveal her sustained interest and engagement with such themes as the human condition, theater, dance, performance, and gender. We really hope you can come to see the show in person because it's pretty spectacular. But this is second best, and we will tour you through it. But before we do, just to set the stage and given the audience, we thought we'd first contextualize the project within the Addison's tradition of supporting women artists via exhibitions, acquisitions, and artist residencies. And in fact, although much is made, and rightly so, of our benefactor, Thomas Cochran, who is an Andover class of 1890 alum, who commissioned our building, which was designed by Charles Platt, established an endowment specifically for the Addison, and donated the museum's core collection of 400 works, which today includes some of our iconic paintings. As Gordon will tell you, the arts at Andover broadly begins before the Addison and with Abbott. So I will pass it back to you, Gordon.
So something that remains a bit of an enigma, particularly amongst maybe the sort of younger generations of alumni, is that there was an art museum at Abbott over 20 years before the Addison opened. So the John Esther Art Gallery opened its doors in 1907 to great fanfare. The president of Harvard actually spoke and gave sort of an odd talk about women's education. But it was the result. This building was through the generosity was given to Abbott through the generosity of Mrs. John Byers, who was born Esther Smith. She was the daughter of Peter and Esther Smith of Smith and Dove Manufacturing Company, the famous Andover textile manufacturer. And in her will, she passed in 1904, she gave $40,000 to Abbott to construct a fireproof building. And a fireproof building is key. There was a great deal, as there is today, but even more so then, a lot of anxiety around the risk of fire to these buildings. So she gave $40,000 to erect a fireproof building for the reception of the various pictures, bronzes, and statuary, which were in her New York home. She had a collection of a few dozen paintings, sort of in typical upper class taste, nothing particularly groundbreaking. The building was constructed in a matter of about a year and opened its doors in 1907. It was largely open to serve the Abbott Academy community, but was open to the public on Saturdays. Unfortunately, one thing that I think Mrs. Byers couldn't foresee was that the $40,000, which of course was an astronomical sum, the turn of the century could not sustain the John Esther Gallery. And also of note, she decided to combine her first name with her husband's first name. So she was the Esther, he was the John. She did not leave an endowment for the perpetual care of her collection, or for the upkeep or exhibition program of the John Esther Art Gallery, which I think one of the more important lessons that our founder, Thomas Cochrane, may have learned, and this is research that I'm under sort of ongoing side project of mine, is to figure out if Thomas Cochrane saw that, without an endowment, that the precarious position of the John Esther Gallery at Abbott, and made it very important in his founding of the Addison to provide for an endowment that continues to kick off funds for the operation of the Addison. Unfortunately, the collection in the building fell into disrepair. It was used quite extensively throughout its lifetime, fell into disrepair. There's a horrible letter from Stephanie Perrin, horrible because she was in the situation that no curator wants to be in, where she describes the conditions of the paintings. She even says that they'd be better off just dumping them on a beach somewhere because they had been in the attic of the John Esther Art Gallery, growing mold, decaying, and they were sold, and the proceeds were turned over to Abbott. Of course, Abbott merged with Phillips Academy a year really after, in 1974. And the proceeds of the John Esther Art Gallery from the deaccessioning of their collection were actually transferred to the Addison, and there is a named John Esther Art Gallery fund. So the legacy of the John Esther Art Gallery lives on in many ways. But turning our attention to the Addison, here's a very early photograph of it just about to open. It opened about a week later after this photo was taken in 1931. The Addison's history, although we often associate Thomas Cochrane, he was our grand benefactor. Of course, he was doing his work anonymously, but he was not doing his work in a vacuum, and he was aided by a number of important figures, and most consequentially, two women, Lizzie Bliss and Zadie Cobb Bliss, her sister-in-law. Zadie Cobb Bliss was a very close personal friend of Thomas Cochrane, and provided a lot of support and funding for the Addison. And the Addison is actually named after her mother, Keturah Addison Cobb. The other woman who had perhaps a much more profound impact on the programming and the trajectory that the Addison would take is Lizzie Bliss, who was recently the subject of a major show at MoMA. But of course, in typical MoMA fashion, if the story didn't happen at MoMA, it didn't happen. So the Addison was completely excluded from this exhibition, even though the Addison, she was one of the major founders, one of the core founders of MoMA, but she had an incredibly important role at the Addison, really pushing on a core 5-person art committee a far more progressive and avant-garde vision of American art. Unfortunately, she passed before the Addison opened, but the Addison was the first institution to show her collection to great controversy, which included some of the sort of canonical European modernists who are now seen as household names and widely accepted, but were quite radical, people like Cézanne and Picasso. She collected in great depth. Her collection was shown here and then was dispersed to MoMA. We received her American work. And we actually, her legacy lives on in odd ways as well. If you see, this is a great photo of her music room, the top floor of her New York City penthouse. You'll see the slip-covered sofas close to the fireplace. Those sofas are currently used in our galleries as our gallery furniture. So you are living and breathing Lizzie Bliss, when you come to the Addison. Women were included not from the core collection of the Addison, but were included in the collection of the Addison from the time the Addison opened in 1931. There was a core collection of about a little over 50 works that Thomas Cochrane gifted to Phillips Academy in 1928 on the occasion of the Academy's 150th anniversary. He then, over the next 3 years, amassed a collection of over 400 works, and was and to his credit included, although there are very few and far between, examples of work by women artists who by that point, these were women artists who were enshrined in the American art historical canon. The most famous American woman artist at the time, Mary Cassatt, was included in our core permanent collection with her Mother and Child in a Boat. Mariah Oakey Dewing was included with her remarkable Bed of Poppies, one of only a handful of known works by Mariah Oakey Dewing, so a very important painting in our collection. But it didn't just stop there, and this is my cue to turn it back to Allie to talk about our early exhibition history. Oh, you're muted, Allie.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep. Soon after the doors were opened, the collection grew. Acquisitions by women artists mostly happened through exhibitions. In the first decade alone were numerous loan exhibitions featuring many women artists, including Georgia O'Keeffe, Lillian Westcott Hale, Agnes Pelton, Wanda Gag, and Marguerite Zorak, to name a few. Early in its history, the Addison recognized the importance of photography as an art form and was one of the first American museums to actively exhibit and collect photography. We offered solo shows by Margaret Bourke-White and Berenice Abbott, and the first photograph to enter the collection was by Margaret Bourke-White. It's this image to the left, looking up inside Sending Tower. We bought that for the princely sum of $5. Now photography numbers more than half the collection, which in total numbers over 28,000 objects. Another early solo show of note was one in 1936, focused on the artist Agna Enters. And I mention her because she is an artist who June saw as a young girl in Tucson and greatly admired her. Enters was a dancer, a mime, a painter, a writer, a novelist, and a playwright who created hundreds of She designed all the props and costumes for her performances. And the Addison actually had 2 solo shows of her work, one in 1936 and one in 1944. And she came and did a performance at the school. And I had not heard of her until working on the Leaf Project, but it turns out she was not only exhibited twice. We had work in the collection, and I think that's really testament to our forebears and them paying attention to women artists, and the fact that we can look back in our collection and make discoveries and rediscoveries constantly of artists who weren't on our radar, who are actually here in the collection. Another, as the decades went on, eventually we moved from loan exhibitions to more Addison organized exhibitions, adding to the roster. And that too included a lot of women artists. Typical of those offerings were shows like the 1949 Material and the Immaterial, which was an amazing show that focused on artists working with translucent materials such as plastic and glass. And it featured work by artists such as Irene Rice Pereira, who you see on the right, Claire Falkenstein, and Emmylou Packard, as well as Nam Gabo, Maholi Naj, and Leo Amino. There were 14 artists in that show, and we purchased work from 9 of them. So that, again, was a way to increase our holdings by women artists. There were also many more solo shows over the decades, from the 30s into more recent history. Artists include, and this is just really the tip of the iceberg, Annie Albers, Maud Morgan, who was a teacher at Abbott, studied with Hans Hofmann, and had a great influence on both Abbott and Andover students. Anne Ryan, Wendy Snyder McNeil also taught at Abbott and influenced countless Abbott students. Inga Marath, Beverly Hallam, Ellen Banks, Joe Sandman, Allison Sarr, Mary Ellen Mark, Alice Neal, Jennifer Bartlett, Trisha Brown, Wendy Ewald, Abbott class of 69, Elizabeth Enders, class of 57, Abbott, and also Sheila Hicks. And that's a huge roll call, but just to show you the extent of artists who have regularly been given solo shows. Those are all solo shows. Next one. Another interesting program was Art Schools USA. This was something instituted by Bart Hayes, the director of the Addison. And in 1948, he polled faculties at 25 art schools across the country to send works to Andover from their most imaginative students. And then this juried show became a summer staple for about, I think, 10 years. But in its first iteration, one of the colleges included was Black Mountain College. So Ruth Asawa was included in that show. She now has a very highly publicized retrospective at San Francisco MoMA that's getting rave reviews. But because she participated in this project, we were not only the first ones to show her work, the first museum, we were the first to acquire her work. And this painting, which we acquired out of that show, is in the SF MoMA show right now. And on the right is a note to Bart Hayes about delivery of the artwork. Gordon, jump in if I missed something there.
The Art Schools USA, and kind of interesting. We were pivotal or very important to the early careers of three major West Coast women artists: Ruth Asawa, Jay DeFeo, and Bernice Bing. So it's an amazing series of exhibitions. We also, through that series, can claim, and it's verified, I promise, we were the first museum to exhibit Andy Warhol's work. He was a student at Carnegie Institute, also Kenneth Nolan, among many others. So an amazing series that is deserving of greater attention and scholarship. But I'll go right back to Allie.
Many, being the first to acquire, the first to show, is Francesca Woodman. She was an Abbott and Phillips Academy student. She was at Abbott 1972 to 73 and PA 73 to 74. She was a student of Wendy Snyder McNeil, and really credits Wendy as being the person who introduced her to photography and set her on the path. And her brother, Don Snyder, was a photo curator at the Addison. So we were the first to show work by her. It was photographs she had made at RISD. She was still at RISD during the show. And it was the first show and the first acquisition of her work. So here is one of the images on the left that we purchased. On the far right is her advertisement for the exhibition that hung in the halls at Elson. And in the middle is her invoice to Don for the 6 prints. And of course, solo and group shows have continued throughout our existence, but we just thought we'd point out a few of the more recent ones. This is Rosamund Purcell, Nature Stands Aside. This was Rosamund's first retrospective and reflected the breadth of her career from the late 1960s to the present. It included over 150 photographs, assemblages, collages, and installations. She was a pioneer of fine art color photography, and she collaborated with paleontologists, anthropologists, historians, museum curators, termite experts, and even a scholar magician to explore the boundaries between science and art. She was in residence during the show and worked with countless students who adored her. And she was on call at all times in the galleries to unsuspecting viewers who would be remarking on her work, and she'd pop in and say, I'm the artist, and start conversation. So it was an incredibly successful show. I forget, Gordon, how old she was, but early 80s, having her first retrospective. And we published a book to coincide with that.
Yeah, it came out just as she turned 80.
Another example of a recent solo show is Allison Elizabeth Taylor, The Sum of It. This was a mid-career survey. She works with the ancient craft of marquetry. All her paintings are really made up of thousands of slivers of different kinds of wood. And she sort of couples that kind of luxurious, antiquated process with very gritty scenes of post-millennial life, and uses the splendor and wow factor of the craft and process to draw attention to the abject and overlooked. She too was an artist in residence and did collage making workshops with students, gave public talks, and the show also had a book with essays by Nomi Fry and Lynn Tillman. We thought it was important to be an all-woman project, and it traveled to the Des Moines Arts Center as well.
And then this is a recent permanent collection installation exhibition that I worked on called Women in Abstraction 1741 to Now. And this came about through my ongoing, if I'm up at 2:30 and can't sleep, I'll go on the Addison's online collections database and just look for things, which is, maybe a testament to how sad my personal life is. But I would go through and I was just blown away. There are works by the kind of canonical women abstractionists that I was well aware of. But when I started to dig deeper and to really broaden my own conception of what abstraction could be, that abstraction does not necessarily have to be quote unquote pure abstraction or work devoid of outside reference. When you kind of liberate yourself from that and liberate yourself from a lot of the narratives of modern art in this country, and start to think about, abstraction is stretching back hundreds of years, millennia, even if you want to consider the work of indigenous artists. This was a great opportunity to mine the depths of the Addison's collection. It was almost entirely comprised of works from the Addison's permanent collection, with a number of loans, which was an amazing partnership with the Peabody Institute just across the street, including, you'll see this Deborah Remington painting, dead center. To the right is a Dine blanket that we were very fortunate to borrow. And this show was really meant to break down a lot of the barriers between quote unquote fine art and craft, and was not meant to be authoritative at all. And I think maybe one male reviewer for the Boston Globe didn't quite get that I was not projecting my own theory of the development of abstraction. It's more to pick apart our preconceptions and ask questions of, can this be perceived as abstraction? Does it matter if we perceive it as abstraction or not, if it can be put in dialogue with these works? So this was a really fulfilling show. We included works by Jennifer Cesare, Elizabeth Enders, Liz Collins. So there was a really wonderful Abbott Phillips Academy presence as well.
And I would just add, well, one, commend Gordon. It's not because he has no life, but his mining the collection, he endlessly brings up brilliant juxtapositions and combinations. And I think there were over 200 works in this exhibition. It was all of upstairs, and there were hundreds more on the cutting floor that were worthy of coming up. We just didn't have the space. So again, testament to the depth and breadth of the collection. Back to you.
And so our collection is still growing. Ali mentioned we have about 28,000 objects currently, over half are photographs. So, we don't have 20,000 paintings hanging in storage. I just want to make you all aware of that, because I think people hear a number and they think something other than maybe the reality. Photos are easier you can collect more photographs because they're a little bit more compact than paintings. But we continue to add to our collection. And these are just some of the works that we've acquired over the last 5 years. I asked our curatorial fellow earlier today to run some data. We're not an institution that really likes to sing our own praises, maybe to our detriment, but we are pretty humble about what we do, and we don't do it virtue signal, or we don't do it to project a certain image that we've carefully cultivated. But we, over the past 5 years, more than half of the works that we've acquired through purchase have been about works by women identifying artists. When you compare that to the typical museum, where only 11% of acquisitions are of work by women artists, without putting too fine a point on it, I would say that the Addison has is certainly leads the field, I would say, in terms of striking a more equitable balance in terms of gender. And we're also, of course, concerned about diversity in all forms. And you'll see that this list includes women of Caribbean heritage, Ana Mendieta, Indigenous American artists, this Major Joan Quick to See Smith, an overlooked but incredibly important photographer, Rosalind Fox Solomon, whose work was not in our collection prior. She's 95 and still making work. She's a remarkable artist. Doris Lee. So not all photography or sort of mid to latter half of the 20th century work. This Doris Lee was not represented in our collection by any major work. She was a leading early to mid 20th century American painter. We seized the opportunity to acquire this really charming work, which relates to a very famous painting of a Thanksgiving feast that's at the Art Institute of Chicago. We have, the New York School of Abstract Expressionism represented in great depth, but we didn't have work by Hedda Stern, who's the only woman included in the famous photo of the Irascibles, the group of renegade abstract expressionists who were fighting against the Met for their lack of interest in abstraction and modernism. Carrie Mae Weems was also not in our collection until the last 5 years. This is a significant work by her that speaks to the tragedy of the murder of Trayvon Martin. Dorothea Tanning, a major figure in surrealism, both on this side of the Atlantic and in Europe, was not represented in our collection. This was a major work. Actually, the executor of her estate is a Phillips Academy graduate. So there are always these amazing connections to be found. Judy Paff, this remarkable, wild work that I think took at least a full day to assemble. That you see in the bottom right. This is now in our permanent collection. This was included in the Women in Abstraction show. This is really just a sample of purchases. So this is not even including gifts of works of art by women artists, which are quite extensive as well. But I think it does speak to our commitment, which we've demonstrated in this talk, and will continue to demonstrate as we continue forward as an institution, our commitment to representing the best of American art, regardless of gender. And then Allie will speak about our remarkable Artist in Residence program.
Yeah, so very early on, really from the beginning, the Addison held the firm belief that all students thrive not only when they have frequent and meaningful encounters with art, but also artists. So the Artist Residency program did not start in 1931, but it began in 1946 with the artist Charles Sheeler. And then it continued informally until 1982, when it was endowed through the generosity of Edward E. Elson, Phillips Academy alum. And then since 1996, thanks to Abbott alum Anne Hatch, visiting artists have the use of an apartment and studio designed and fabricated by David Ireland, who is a San Francisco-based conceptual artist. And this is actually an accessioned work in our collection. So every year we bring, depending on the duration of the residencies, which can be anything from a full year to a couple weeks to short visits throughout the course of a year. We bring about 2 to 3 artists to campus each year, emerging and established from diverse backgrounds, working in a range of media. They can give talks, they can critique student work, they can lead workshops. There just has to be engagement with students, both at PA and within the larger community. So here we have I'll go clockwise, the upper left, Sue McNally was an artist in residence last year. We had recently purchased a monumental landscape painting by her that was included in one of our exhibitions. And she was in residence for several months, creating new work in the artist studio. And while creating new work, worked with students of all different ages, both in PA and the greater community. Next is Lori Simmons. She was in residence for just a couple of days. We own the complete set of her In and Around the House, which is her first series that works with the Dollhouse. And it's a seminal series made when she was barely out of school. So we think it's super important because it's great for students to be able to see something made early that kind of set the course for an artist. Next is Jennifer Cesare. She was in residence last year. Many of you may have seen her 2 installations, which were funded by the Abbott Academy Fund and part of the Abbott and Andover celebration. Jennifer designed 2 pieces, one for the Addison facade and a bench for the Abbott campus, which is actually still in situ. And after spending a week of installing where students can observe what she did, she met with lots of classes. And I know, Jennifer, you're out there. We put her to work. She met with all different courses. For example, a history course that was women's gender and sexuality studies, which looked at her work in the context of gender roles and hierarchy. She also worked with painting and visual studies students to talk about artistic process and the contrast between private work in the studio and collaborative work required for public installations. She worked with art and activism students to talk about the impact of public-facing artwork and the power of art to affect change. And she worked with English, studying hybrid forms, genre non-conforming art, to talk about artwork and literature that refuses categorization. She also worked with a bunch of community schools, and she led workshops for the Abbott Bazaar. So we were thrilled to have her, and that was an especially active residency, but really fruitful. So Jennifer, thank you there. Lower left is Sheila Hicks. We had a retrospective of Sheila, who works with textile. And she was in residence during that, doing weaving workshops with students. Lorna Simpson is in the middle. We hosted her retrospective, and she spent a few days meeting with students, critiquing their work and talking about her own. And in the lower right is Anila Aga, who did an incredible light installation and spent several days working with students and talking about the way her art is influenced by both Eastern and Western traditions. And then here we have in this contact sheet, June Leaf. We've got there, and it's 7:30, so this is good timing. This is a contact sheet that shows June in 1991. She was an artist in residence at the Addison. So the show that's up now is really a bit of a full circle. It was Jock Reynolds who brought a retrospective that was, or a survey show that was organized by Washington Project for the Arts and curated by Philip Brookman to the Addison. And at that time, I was an intern at the Addison, and Gordon is quick to remind me that he wasn't, or he was just about to be born. So there's that. But this show was my first introduction to June's work, and I remember being absolutely floored and captivated by her art. And I wasn't the only one. Students in our larger community were absolutely enthralled with her. So it was really a thrill to come back to June and organize this new project. And it was a labor of love. It's 5 years in the making. Gordon and I had the privilege of working with her for most of those years, visiting the studio, which is a completely magical place. And sadly, she passed away this past summer, and we were heartbroken not to have her see the fruits of all of the labor, but we think she would be really proud of the results. And just as a quick intro, and I don't know, Gordon, should we go to the next slide or? Oh, well, yes, it's your turn, right?
Yeah, no, I'll just mention June Leaf. Before I knew about June Leaf, I knew this image, and this is one of the, I think, one of the most iconic works by the great fashion and celebrity photographer Richard Avedon. And this is a photograph taken of June outside her home in Mabu, Nova Scotia, and Cape Breton, which we'll talk in greater depth about. Richard Avedon had actually gone up to Nova Scotia to photograph June Leaf's husband, Robert Frank, who, of course, at that time was, and remains one of the most notable and famous American photographers. He was there to photograph Robert, but I mean, saw June and could not help himself. He had to photograph her. And he would later say that she was the most beautiful woman that he had ever photographed. And of course, you can't judge someone based on their appearance. But I think if you just, there's something so remarkable about June's eyes and expression in this work. There's a serenity and a kind of a knowing quality, this kind of beguiling quality about her that is really channeled through her art. So you do, in a way, get a sense of June in this work. What's really interesting, though, is as a sculptor, she's withholding her hands, and hands play a really important role or an important motif in her work. So she's photographed really without the tools, her most important tools, which were her hands. But we wanted, sometimes people don't know, people might not have a clue who June Leaf was, although that's not to say that she was, incredibly, she was well known. She's certainly not a household name, but she is well known. But this, people might know her face. You're more likely perhaps to know her face than her name, but we wanted to orient you, just in case you have no idea who this person is, that you may have seen her face before.
Yeah. And I think that's the important, the other part of hiding her hands, disguising the importance of that, but also a protective sort of stance. People always that we met throughout this project talked about how they came for Robert, they stayed for June. So she met a lot of people in the art world who came to sort of meet Robert Frank, show him their work, but then were enchanted by June. And she was by no means an outsider in the art world. She showed regularly. She had a reputation far beyond New York and Nova Scotia, but she stuck to a distinct vision regardless of trends. And I think in doing that, this artist, storyteller, dancer, and engineer produced an extraordinary body of work that revels in the human experience in all its banality and sublimity. But people don't know what to do with her. They didn't know how to pin her down. And I think in some ways that prevented her from getting the attention other artists were getting. And I have to acknowledge Lucy Lepard, an Abbott alum as well, for one, pointing this out, and for her writings on June Leaf were really invaluable to Gordon and I as we wrote our essay for the book. But she points out this, the fact that because people couldn't pin her down in their criticism of her or reviews of her work, they always sort of danced around it. And she pointed to a quote that I think is really interesting that I want to read to everybody. It was from a 1973 New York Times review by John Cannaday. And he said, "Miss Leaf is an exception to everything, including every specific aesthetic standard ever formulated. And I'm going to throw her out pending a session with Roget's International Thesaurus to see whether there is a synonym for repellent that means attractive, and whether it is possible to invent some verbal dodge that will equate her rough and ready, 3 sheets to the wind, and bases full technique with the acuity of her perceptions. Until I get this figured out, I can only suggest a visit to her show." So that kind of throwing out those phrases and really not getting to the point is exactly what most people did. And Lucy Lepard was the one who really grappled with the work, looked at it, figured it out, and shared incredible insights into the work. But with Cannaday, although he was flummoxed by the polarities, the vulgarity, and the attractiveness in June's work, he did correctly recognize the acuity of her perceptions. And this is something Lucy describes as visual wisdom. And I think that is sort of the secret to June. She is always looking. She's an amazing observer, but more than looking, she's seeing. And in everything she does, it's that seeing that shows us things we often overlook. But the most basic aspects of what it is to be human is revealed in her art over and over again. Back
Yeah.
to you, Gordon.
Yeah. So this is what you would see when you ascend the stairs and reach the second floor landing, our title wall, and then you'll see there's a little gallery which we'll show you one picture of later at the end, but you can see that Richard Avedon portrait of June through the opening. That's a gallery that we transformed into a sort of kind of a look inside June's mind. You have most of the books that deal with her work available for perusal there. We also have 2 cases filled with sketchbooks and letters. She was a prolific correspondent. She really actually has said that some of her best drawings were done in letters and left behind a trove that is still relatively untapped of correspondence. So we were able to mine that, and I think it adds some really wonderful context to the exhibition. As Ali mentioned, her work, most people have sort of avoided engaging with her work in a lot of ways because it is so complex. It's so defiant of genre, and I think kind of persistently so and intentionally so defiant of genre, and resists any sort of easy categorization. There are perhaps at various points in her career artists where you could say, oh, there's a certain affinity here, particularly with her early work. The artist Red Grooms is typically brought up, but her trajectory, her work really defies easy categorization or the overlay of a rigid chronology. So Ali and I, when we were conceiving of this exhibition, which I should mention was co-organized by the Allen Memorial Art Museum at Oberlin with our co-curator Sam Adams, we really wanted to we didn't want to overlay this sort of rigid foreign chronology over her work that implies, as chronologies do, some sort of beginning and an end and some sort of clear trajectory. There was no clear kind of direct trajectory there, in a sense that she, didn't start one place and end somewhere. She constantly revisited, re-engaged with, and in some cases reworked. She would pull out paintings from the 1950s, well, almost to her death, to continue to work on them. There's this circularity, there's this recurrence where she would go back and engage with these themes that are present from the very beginning, but in radically different ways and across media. She considered herself really first and foremost a painter, although Ali and I think would really see her primary strength as sculpture and drawing. But she was one informed the other. There is no linear, you cannot superimpose a linear narrative onto her work. She was working at the intersection of really all media with a certain facility that is quite remarkable. This first work that you see, which we framed on the door, is a really interesting piece called Woman Theater from 1968. And although she would sort of leave behind this kind of grotesque, carnivalesque, garish, a caricatured style behind, as she moved into a sort of a more austere, stripped down kind of motif, a lot of the themes remained. And one of the principal themes that continued to animate her work was the theater. She was drawn to performance from a very young age. She grew up, I should mention, she was born in 1929. She grew up in a decidedly middle-class Jewish Russian immigrant family in the north side of Chicago. Her parents actually owned and operated a liquor store slash tavern. Her mother was a very focused, very intelligent businesswoman. She was sort of forced into that role because her husband, June's father, was a gambler. He was a dreamer. He was an artist without the sort of any sort of ability to become an artist. He was very resistant to conventional forms of labor, so he left the running of the family's liquor store largely to June's mother. And those sort of early glimpses at the sort of depravity of the human condition really animated and June's work from the beginning. Well, there will always be, it could be a very placid scene or seemingly placid scene that's being depicted in June's work or examined in June's work. But there is always this element, just as there is in life, this element of some darkness sort of or danger lurking, sometimes right around the corner, sometimes in areas that are less easily perceived. This is a larger than life sculpture that is almost two-dimensional, goes flat against a wall, but has these amazing hanging components made of tin. She was very resourceful with her materials. She would scavenge around New York City. She would often not melt down, but heat and flatten sardine tins, apple juice containers. She found her materials really outside of the mainstream. And this work, it was included in her New York City debut in 1968 to 69 at Alan Frumpkin Gallery. Alan Frumpkin was her longtime dealer. They met in Chicago. She's from Chicago. I'll do very broad strokes. Grew up in Chicago, went to Paris when she was about 17 years old and had a very formative experience there, and was really seen as this great American young ingenue, but really resisted being pigeonholed as sort of the pretty young, intelligent artist of the week in Paris. So she fought against that. She returned to Chicago. She enrolled very briefly at a state school in Illinois. She was sort of forced by her mother. Her mother desperately wanted her to be a really nice Jewish girl that she could marry off to a nice boy. As you know, her sister had followed her mother's instructions. June was not going to follow her instructions. She left the state school, went to the new Bauhaus in Chicago, got what she needed to get out of it, which took her about three months of work or so. Very brief stint at the new Bauhaus. She would return later on and finish her degree, but she was then brought back to teach after sort of leaving after 3 months. So she was this prodigious, very accomplished figure from a very young age, but she was well known in Chicago. She came of age with a group of artists who would become known as the Monster Roster. People like Leon Golub, Nancy Sparrow, H.C. Westerman. These were artists who were all coming up from the Art Institute of Chicago. She was the only non-Art Institute of Chicago student really involved in the Monster Roster, although she was not one to ever be officially affiliated with any group. But she was beloved in Chicago. She went to New York the late 50s, early 60s after another important trip to Paris. And it took her almost a decade to have her first New York show. And there's a great review in Art Forum written by Robert Pincus Witten. And he says that it is regrettable that June Leaf has waited for so many years before holding her first one-man exhibition in New York City. The most recent was held in Chicago in 1965, and before that, a decade previously in the same city. Owing to her enormous conscientiousness and reticence to show, the present exhibition is inevitably going to be viewed either as a raunchy reworking of Chicago nostalgia or an even more rank and fetid rendition of Red Grooms. Both views probably have some basis in the fact, yet, had June Leaf shown on her return from Paris after her Fulbright year of 1958 to 59, I have little doubt that she would have been greeted as a master of what was still waiting to be called pop art. She was also never one to seek the kind of recognition either through the market, through critics. She was not there to play the art game. I think that allowed her to maintain her integrity and really singularity of vision. But it did, I think, prevent her from receiving the recognition during her lifetime, and particularly at that period of her career that she deserved as really one of the foremothers of pop art. Here are some overall views of the exhibition. You'll see that we're mixing, just as June went from painting to sculpture and one informed the next, we're jumping across media and across time periods, although you're really oriented in this first gallery at the origins of June's career and her persistent lifelong interest in certain themes. So we're looking at the street broadly. She loved to observe people, as Ali mentioned. She starting her observations at her parents' liquor store. She took dance classes in the Loop in Chicago and would go on the elevated train, and has this wonderful quote about riding between the cars and just staring into the windows as she walked by, and just observing the gold lettering and all of the amazing displays of toys and of department stores, and just falling in love with she was kind of a flaneur as a young child. She was just observing. She was an open sponge. She was kind of just taking it all in, and so informed by those really early aesthetic experiences as a child. One of those really early aesthetic experiences was actually witnessing a frequent customer to her family's liquor store, who was a blonde, a larger bodied blonde woman sitting on a stool and urinating down the stool. That stuck in her mind, as I don't think you could
As it
really,
would.
as it would, you can't really dislodge that from your mind. She talks about, her childhood was spent in this space that smelled of urine and vomit. She had kind of a rough and tumble, raucous, honky tonk kind of upbringing in some respects, but that image was just lived in her mind. And she talks a lot about these characters. So it was a character. This woman was a character in her mind, and she waited and waited to sort of release that character. And she did that with this significant work called Ascension of Pig Lady, which was the big showstopper in her show Street Dreams, which was her 1968 debut in New York City. This is massive. This has not been installed in over 30 years. The last time, it's not owned by the Addison, it's owned by the Museum of Contemporary Art Chicago. The last time it was installed was actually at the Addison in 1991. So it was a lot of fun and a little scary to try to reconstruct this based on some notes from 40 plus years ago, and also unfortunately, without the artist alive to offer some input. I won't go into great detail, but this work was really sparked not only of her memory of this woman, but that was sort of catalyzed further by her observation of a waitress. She was in a bus. She would observe New York City from the bus. And she saw in this restaurant window, and she saw this blonde waitress, and she thought, in 1968, the Messiah, who would the Messiah be? The Messiah might as well be a waitress. And so she, and this work was described, which I can't do a better job, and it's a brief quote, in the same review that I quoted from earlier. The reviewer describes: a wretched porcine waitress is dragged smirking into a voyeuristic proscenium heaven. Observing this epiphany as a little girl rolling a hoop, the image of insouciant innocence, tinseled and driven crazy by the spectacle. That little figure is undoubtedly June Leaf herself. She often described herself as being this she would just be kind of shot out and released into the universe and taking it all in. She also said that the woman in red in between is, in another article from around this time, is a representation of her mother. But I think June Leaf herself is really the portrait of insouciant innocence, tinseled and driven crazy by the spectacle. This is a monumental work that you really must explore in person. So we're kind of going forward and backwards. This is going backwards a little bit, but this is a major pivotal work called Arcade Women. And I realize we don't have much time, so I'll rush.
Yeah.
This is June's. This is kind of a diploma painting in a lot of ways. June knew that if she wanted to be taken seriously as a painter, she needed to master the basics. She didn't receive a traditional arts education, so she taught herself, and she taught herself by studying the masters. And she really knew that she would be stuck if she didn't learn how to render three-dimensional spaces in 2D. So she learned a linear perspective, and this is her great sort of, this is what I learned, this is what I am capable of, this wild, menacing kind of grid of these women trapped in rooms, speaking in a lot of ways to the restricted roles of women that she observed in her childhood. You'll also see another major work, the Vermeer box, June's first sculpture. This is a direct interpretation of a Vermeer painting called The Wine Glass from 1660. She became fixated on reinterpreting the rooms of Vermeer because she, I think, could see beyond the surface into a perhaps darker reality underlying these images and underlying the interaction between men and women in the paintings of Vermeer. So she was fixated on making these two-dimensional works come to life. And so she decided, I'm going to build a diorama. She grew up going to the Art Institute, which has these major, remarkable miniature rooms. So I think that is being drawn upon. But she wanted to make the room out of mirrors. And so the woman is actually almost imperceptible. She's kind of gnarled and covered in mirrors. So you are sort of, your reflection becomes part of her figure. But you see the gnashing man with the teeth. She made 32 individual teeth. Anyway, I could go on. She also made paintings, but she does say, and this is where I will promise I'll stop talking. She says that's the whole point. Now we come to the secret, the real secret. Speaking of this work, the secret is what I must have seen as a child. The secret is that in this room is all the treachery that's possible between people. He's going to destroy her. In this safe, quiet, clean room with all the shadows, the bookcases, and the pictures are all the worst things that can happen: betrayal, lovelessness, falseness, and lies.
And I think we should just, I know we're running out of time, but for the Vermeer, it's a good example too of her use of sculpture, because she did do painted versions of the painting as well. And she just talks about how it wasn't quite right. It wasn't, she was trying to figure out what the life force behind that painting was. And so she said to herself, if you can't paint it, then make it. So there's always this back and forth of using sculpture to actually make it, and then going back to painting so that the painting has increased depth and a sense of life, authenticity. Okay, so then pretty soon after the Street Dreams success, she talks about coming home one night after one of her lively walks through the city, and Robert Frank tells her he wants to move to Nova Scotia and she should go find a house. She did do that, but it wasn't her idea, and she didn't want to move. She describes herself as the quintessential city girl. And he sends her to Mabu, which is a rural village on the west coast of Cape Breton Island. And they moved there in 1970, spending the bulk of the half year there and half in New York. And they continued to do that on and off until the end of their lives. But the first few years, they were there full time. And she talks about being adamant about doing that, even though she wasn't crazy about the move, because she remembered being a tourist or a summer resident in the Hamptons one summer. And she was appalled by the bad behavior by the artists who just come into a town, don't really engage, mess it all up, and go home in the fall. So she was determined to immerse herself. And later she talks about this. She said it was like going off to a little island in our early middle age, starting over at life. It was the end of Street Dreams, the end of childhood. And it definitely does mark an end, in that, not so much an end, but a dramatic transition in her work. She still remains the great observer. It's really just the scenery that changes, and it does impact her style. And she talks about being completely incapacitated. She talks about all the pine trees, which she calls Christmas trees, which are horrible and boring and verboten to a Jewish girl. And what is she going to do with all this bleakness and isolation? And you can see that in a lot of the collages where she's in the studio and the landscape is sort of held back through the window frame of the studio, this sort of push and pull of hesitancy. But she begins to redirect herself, sort of putting her head down, and she talks about just drawing her way out of this. So she starts drawing everything from garden hoses to old chairs to clotheslines to her neighbors. And it's really the neighbors, the latter, she credits with accelerating her adaptation, the connection to people. But in addition to sort of that wide-ranging cataloging, she narrows her vision. Her friend gave her a microbiology textbook, and she starts studying microbiology, which is so typical of June. She built her own forge. She took auto mechanic classes. She does whatever it takes to meet her goal. So she studied these textbooks. She bought 2 microscopes, and she started to look at microorganisms. And at that time, for example, in this piece, To Create Life Out of Life, chemistry beakers, science labs, microscopes, figures with microscope heads, biomechanical bodies start to appear in her work. But it was the close analysis through the microscope that kind of led to a eureka moment. And she talks about looking into the microscope. She says, I remember looking into the microscope and saw what was there. I thought, it's the loop. It's the loop. It's the same thing. They're mean and they're eating each other and they're shitting all over everything. They're fighting. It's war. It's what I know. So sort of recognizing the underlying connection between city and nature and just the basic business of survival, and the poetry and drama that occurs everywhere and binds us all, whether it's city or nature, kind of provided her with the unifying themes she was looking for to sort of proceed with her work, which does, though, become much less body and raucous as the Street Dream work and much more pared down and focused on sort of transcends the particular and a lot of the autobiographical to become more timeless. And here are just examples of some of these rooms. We actually, in our heads, structured rooms with phrases from June's writing. So this one that starts with the move to Mabu and microscopes is called To Create Life Out of Life. Looking, closely observing life, processing it, spitting it back out in revelatory ways. The next room we call Perpetual Motion. Staircases, scrolls, circles, dance. She explores perpetual motion, both dark and light, from joyful dancing to the slog of just keeping on, keeping on. But that's all part of life and life affirming in both the dark and lightness of it. This is another view of that kind of imagery. Sculptures, paintings, works on paper, repurpose things, egg beaters.
And a lot of these materials have really, so even if she's not explicitly referencing autobiography through her material choices of materials, she really is. Egg beaters become a really important motif for her, but perhaps most importantly, sewing machines, which she had always fixated on sewing machines. She always wanted one. It all ties back to a story. She has these vivid memories of her mother's foot pushing on the pedal, and being underneath her mom's sewing table and being handed a swatch of blue fabric and thinking that her mother was handing her the Starry Night. And so that, she always wanted to own a sewing machine. She ended up getting one, and then she would rip it apart and try to rebuild it as her, certainly how she processed things. But sewing machines play a major role in her work, and a motif that reappears quite frequently. And you'll see another work with sewing machine components as well.
And all of them, which you will see very quickly, are movable and manipulated.
Yes.
Not in this show, but
no. But we're going to show you a video. So this is a third gallery that we're calling or the next gallery, which we're calling Prophecy of Her Power, which is derived from a quote where June actually talks about the sort of relationship that a young girl has with horses, and that the horse and its power to make life is a prophecy of a young girl's power to make life through pregnancy. June Leaf had a very complicated relationship with the feminist movement, as we call it. She I think a lot of people have wanted to sort of co-opt her as a feminist artist, and I think the very basic principles of feminism are things that she was very, very in favor of. But she was, again, never one to join an organized movement. So she, at one point, there are these really interesting quotes where she says, I've fought for decades and decades and decades, and now I'm supposed to look back and just continue to blame men for everything. I've forged my path. I've fought ahead. If we want to, what we should really do at this point is build a monument so big that up to women that the men can't help but ignore us, because it'll be able to be viewed from space. So she engaged in a lot of really interesting works around the idea of the monument and the female form as a monument. And there are myriad associations that we could go into that we will not. But the cornerstone of this gallery also is this motif that we start to see previewed in earlier works, but it's more fully fleshed out by the 70s, of this sort of distended pregnant head, which of course, pregnant with ideas, pregnant with life, there are, again, associations galore. But you start to see this distended, elongated head appearing in her work. She talks later on, some of her stories verge on the apocryphal, and she had a sort of self-mythology that became more and more refined as time went on. But she does talk about the origin of this motif being found in the painting that you see to its right, the central big head. You see that painting where she talks about being on a ferry in Canada and seeing a buoy or mooring on the water, and that form being sort of refracted or reflected in a strange way on the water, and that kind of triggering this idea in her mind. You can also sort of see next to that painting the title work, Shooting from the Heart, which is actually in the Addison's collection. The head, though, is what remains from a very interesting collaboration. June was invited by Lippincott, which is foundry in Connecticut, that realized many complicated sculptural projects for artists. They gave her carte blanche, which I think she was really trying to see how much she could get away with. There are great quotes where she said, I can have all the money I want. I can have all the time I want. You'll let me do whatever I want. She initially wanted to have a fully a full a kind of a major automaton, full length form that could walk on a treadmill, but she ended up, because of time and material considerations, ended up creating this head, which was forged at Lippincott and is kinetic. So hopefully this will work. Yeah, here's a video. It gets a little, I'll keep talking until it gets interesting, but you can see you're meant to turn it. It activates this bellows. So there's a really interesting, also 19th century sort of anticipating steampunk culture. These gears, these rusty kind of mechanisms, this sort of Victorian sensibility. And you see here
and
that
her eyes are fluttering.
her eyes are glowing, and then the tongue, you can see the tongue is sort of wagging or moving out of its mouth. Other works in this section, Prophecy of Her Power. We're going into our final section, couples, which is, again, not just kind of canonical heterosexual husband and wife lover couples, but also more broadly looking at interpersonal relationships. There's a fantastic work called Sisters, which is a two-headed snake that looks, one head is about to eat the other, which I think is autobiographical. But then really the great star of this room is Two Women on a Jag. I don't know, Allie, if you want to set this up and then I can play the video.
This is just another sculpture exploring duos, and it has a crowbar, which you will see when activated. The women are set into motion and play the drum. And there's June. It makes a lot of clattering noise too, which is part of it.
And this video was made right outside of her house on 7 Bleecker Street and was shot by her dear friend Joan Jonas, another titan of 20th century American art, who contributed to our catalog. I mentioned at the very beginning we have this great sort of June Leaf reading room where you can look at all the catalogs that have been published on June, including our own. And we have this really wonderful short video of June working in her studio in her late 80s. And a lot of the works that are featured in this video actually appear in the exhibition. So even though we are not able to activate the sculptures, but though, as you can tell from her video, they're a lot more durable than you might think. They were meant to fall. They were meant, they don't break. If they fall and if they break, they were repaired. But, you know, she was not precious about her own work. And they're a lot more secure than you might think. There is a book, which June Leaf Shooting from the Heart, we co-published with Rizzoli. Allie and I wrote the lead essay. There are 2 essays by our co-curator, Sam Adams. And then we have a foreword by Joan Jonas and an afterword by Kara Walker. Having other voices, one artist being her contemporary, one of a slightly younger generation. This amazing insight into her impact, often unsung impact on artists. Again, people came for Robert but stayed for June, and she formed some really important relationships and inspired a number of artists, including notably Kara Walker and Joan Jonas. The show lives on. We really urge you to see it here at the Addison for obvious reasons, but then also because this is the largest iteration. We have the biggest and the nicest space. And we are showing a lot more work that, or not a lot, but
It'll be
considerably more work than you'll see elsewhere. We're very pleased that it's going to the Gray Art Museum, which is literally in June's backyard. We'll be there in the fall. So if you are in New York, please see the show there. It's then going to the Allen Memorial Art Museum at Oberlin College. We're thrilled that we have 3 teaching museums, 3 museums that are free, completely free to the public. So we're hoping that June's work can continue to inspire the next generation, as she did when she was here in 1991, and hopefully as she's doing, even though she's not with us, in 2025.
Yes.
And that's it. But I don't know
That's
if
it.
anyone's still listening, but
I know. Is anyone
we're happy to answer questions. If anyone has any questions that they'd like to pose, we would be delighted to answer them. I think that's part of the program. But Jenny,
I
tell
know,
us if we're meant to wrap it up.
No, it's so good. I mean,
follow
I
your
will leave
lead?
it. Yeah, I'll leave it to our community gathered here. If there are folks who want to ask a question, we can see on the screen if you're raising your hand, or you can put it into the chat. Gordon and Allie, that was amazing. I'm sure you all can understand why the Addison and these colleagues are such a gift to this school. They are remarkable to work with. So if anybody has a question, you want to put it into the chat, or you want to raise your hand, we're happy to unmute you and you can ask your question.
No pressure. There aren't any.
No pressure. And you know where to find us.
Yes, you can always
Questions
find us. Yes.
Occur.
But
We
the
hope
show
that
will
this
be up.
yeah, great, Gordon, exactly.
Yeah, the show, sorry, I should mention, the show will
Yes.
be up through July 31st,
July.
right here. So if you're coming back for reunion or any of the great events during the summer, please stop by the Addison. We are, of course, always free and always open to the public. Bring your friends.
Yes.
And we
Spread
have a
the
lot
word.
of great stuff on view, not just June Leaf, but we have related permanent collection shows. One curated by our assistant curator that looks at performance and persona. Allie curated a great photo show on dynamic duos. There's also a permanent collection sort of greatest hits show up right now. One gallery is just Winslow Homer and Aiken. So there's a lot of great stuff to see. There's one question I see.
Yes. The Deloitte.
Yeah, so the ceiling, which I think it speaks to the power of that work that you think that there might be a connection, because it was a work that was made for the 1993, I believe, wall drawing retrospective that was organized at the Addison, and it was purposely designed for that space, and it's one of the very few works that you are guaranteed to see, since we have no permanently installed galleries. It's one of the few works that you're guaranteed to see on any visit to the Addison. But what's remarkable about it is, even though you might think it would compete with the work on view in the gallery, it never does. And it seems to complement the work more than anything. Even 19th century painting shows.
Yeah. And when
it works.
Solowit installed it, he actually chose his favorite paintings from the collection, which ended up being mostly 19th century paintings beneath that. So it really does speak to whatever we put there.
Yeah. And under layers and layers of paint, there are galleries full of Solowit murals.
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know if we have any questions. We're thrilled. Thank you so much for inviting us.
Thank
We're always
you.
happy.
Gordon, Allie, thank you very much. It is it's great to bring the Addison to our community around the country and around the world. And it's very special to demonstrate this Abbott legacy. I think for those of us who are on campus, we're very well aware of where the Abbott legacy is thriving all over campus. And I will share that this is a whole new element for me to learn this evening. So thank you very much for sharing all of it. And thanks to the rest of you for being in community this evening. I hope it is warmer wherever you are than it is here in Andover. And I will wish everyone a great evening. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Caitlin. Thanks, Lynn.
Good night, Jenny. See you tomorrow.
Good night.